Hi, everyone. I'm Alice,
And I'm Aaron.
and this is Waterfront
Waterfront
Wednesdays,
Wednesdays,
brought to you by
Boston
Boston
Harbor
Harbor
Now.
Now. Today's guest is my colleague, Aaron Toffler, who joined Boston Harbor Now as our Director of Policy in December of 2019.
Hi, Alice. It's great to be on the vlog, though I expected my Waterfront Wednesday premiere to be filmed in our office.
I certainly did too, but not only has COVID-19 changed a lot of our personal plans over the past few months, it's also exposed many inequities across our society, including here in the Boston region.
It certainly has, and with that have come increased calls for addressing social and environmental justice.
Those are terms that, along with gentrification and displacement, are part of a conversation about creating a more equitable waterfront.
And today we'll be defining and unpacking them.
Let's start by talking about some of the work you've done, Aaron, in different communities, beginning at the Urban Ecology Institute.
So the premise of the Natural Cities program at the Urban Ecology Institute was that when development is proposed in a community, the private developers and the public agencies that do the permitting for the projects both have attorneys, but communities typically don't. So we were the attorneys for those communities who let them know what their rights were and what laws and regulations were at their disposal so they could create a community that reflected their aspirations without walling them off or leading to gentrification.
And what communities were you working in?
Primarily Chelsea and East Boston, where we worked on projects like restoring salt marsh habitat on Mill Creek, building a waterfront park at the Condor Street Urban Wild, and generally representing the community in their efforts to fend off unwanted development.
Both the city of Chelsea and the neighborhood of East Boston are often labeled as environmental justice communities. What does that mean?
So typically that means that they've been subjected to decades of environmental injustice, that they bear a disproportionate number of environmentally harmful uses, think storage, oil storage facilities, road salt storage, parking lots, that kind of thing, and that they have fewer environmental amenities like street trees and parks. Low-income communities of color also have pollution from highways, congested living quarters, and generally bad public transportation infrastructure that they're dealing with.
And then what does the environmental justice part come from?
So that term is a recognition that the environmental amenities and the environmentally harmful things that we want in our society are not equally distributed. So if we all benefit from these things like safe roads and heating oil from our homes, then we should all bear the burden of their location in our communities. The standard definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And environmental justice is really the marriage of the civil rights movement and the more traditional environmental movement, which is dominated by white middle-class people focused more on conservation than social or urban issues.
Once the civil rights movement and the environmental movement came together to define this term and push for these kinds of changes, they were able to lobby the federal government until the Executive Order 12898 was issued. That was the Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations, which was issued by President Clinton back in 1994.
That's right, and that executive order directed, and I'll quote the EPA website here, it directed federal agencies to identify and address the disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of their actions on minority and low-income populations to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law.
Once that went into effect, we've had 26 years of federal precedent in order to lobby for making more of these changes.
That's right.
So recognizing that neighborhoods where incomes are low and there's limited access to public amenities, one might call them environmental injustice communities, one way to improve them is to build parks. This can help provide opportunities for fitness, for community gatherings, You can introduce plants and trees that help clean the air.
That's right. Parks and street trees are great. They can reduce the impact of local emissions. They add pervious surfaces to the community that recapture groundwater, mitigate heat island effects by adding shade, and they increase social capital by adding places where the community can come together informally.
New parks can sound like a silver bullet, but we know that they're a little more complicated.
It's true, there is a tension for local residents between building a better neighborhood for themselves and knowing that those improvements could attract new residents willing to pay higher rents and who may make the neighborhood less affordable for the people who are there now.
Which is sort of the definition of gentrification. It's not only about housing becoming more expensive, it's also about retail getting more expensive as new grocery stores and shops and restaurants arrive to cater to a wealthier clientele.
Right, and all of these increased costs contribute to displacement as people are no longer able to afford the housing or other amenities that are in their neighborhoods.
Some real estate developers choose to pay money into a fund to build affordable housing elsewhere. Others choose to build affordable housing on site or nearby in order to preserve opportunities for lower income residents to continue to live in the neighborhood.
Right. I always prefer the option of building on site because that allows folks in affordable housing units to live sort of interspersed throughout the community on the waterfront and other places. And that strategy, as well as community land trusts, are effective ways to protect existing residents from the pressures of gentrification.
Yeah. Some parks, though, have really effectively served the neighborhoods around them. The Condor Street Urban Wild that you mentioned earlier comes to mind, as well as Lopresti Park, both in East Boston. They're serving people who lived there. They were designed in partnership with communities.
That's right. There have been a lot of parks built in East Boston by the city and by Massport, but there's also been higher-end residential development as well on the waterfront. So there are improvements for the people who live there, but there are still pressures from gentrification.
And what about in Chelsea?
So when I worked in Chelsea, a lot of residents there didn't even realize that their community was surrounded by water. They had never been down to the waterfront. It just wasn't in their consciousness. And part of that was because the designated port area limits public access to the waterfront, and almost the entire waterfront there is designated port area.
There's one little piece, the Port Park next to Eastern Salt, that's been a partial solution to that lack of access.
Right, that park has been great. It's been very successful in drawing people down to the waterfront. It's got activities for them, but there still remains this tension between public access and a working port. Some port areas are seen by the community as sort of a buffer against gentrification. Better to live with a port use that you know than to risk a high-end development. So while the community wants more waterfront access, they don't necessarily want that port designation to go away.
What about places where there are new waterfront parks and public spaces being provided by private developers, where that development is happening?
So that's where the community and other advocates can play a role in ensuring that those spaces feel welcoming to everyone, whether they're local neighborhood residents or not.
And that can be through design, programming, music choices, amenities, security protocols.
Yep, those are all factors. What's important is that the spaces feel welcoming, not only to the residents of the newer, more expensive housing, but also to the people who already live in the community. The way that you can help to ensure this is to encourage participation by the entire community in the permitting of these projects. That's when you can have an impact on what the project looks like. We have to do a better job of encouraging that participation, which obviously got more difficult during the COVID crisis. And I think it all goes back to the definition of environmental justice, which is providing a meaningful opportunity for people to participate in the development and implementation of laws and regulations in the areas where they live, work, and play.
Absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in. I'm Aaron Toffler.
And I'm Alice Brown.
You can follow me on Twitter at Harbor Walking.
And you can follow me at Fairy Fairy.
If you like this video, give us a like or leave a comment below.
or tell your friends, or subscribe to this channel for lots of great harbor content.
See you on the waterfront.